Estate Planning Stories. I'm Gary Anderson, financial advisor, Anderson Advisors.
And I'm Kevin Tharp, elder law and estate planning attorney.
Kevin, we're going to continue talking about estate planning stories because I know you have a lot of stories and they're fantastic examples of the way people have done things over the years in a way that you've been able to help them change things to have a better outcome. And this is important. And I think a lot of people will see themselves in these stories that you tell. And estate planning really is important because it's going to determine what happens to things after you die.
Yeah, Gary, that first story is so prevalent. It's so many times I've seen that in my career where a person thinks they have all their estate planning done because they have it in a document, and that document's going to take care of everything. The document's going to help them avoid probate. That's not going to happen if you have a will. They think that the document decides how things are distributed and divided up, and then they find out that all of a sudden that bank account that was supposed to be split 3 ways doesn't get split 3 ways. Now, there are stories, good stories, where that ended up happening. The individual ended up sharing the money, but even then, even with the good story, there's still could be a possible bad ending, because if my dad leaves the bank account to me and I decide I'm going to share it with my brothers, then there is a tax consequence for me sharing that money with my brothers rather than no tax consequence had it been shared, the gift come from our father. So it's real important then to get your wishes and title coordinated together, and you cannot do that if you have a will. You can do that if you have a trust, and if it's a revocable trust, you don't give up ownership. But Gary, here's another story I see all the time, and you and I have seen it in our industries quite a bit. Fortunately, it has not happened to any of our clients, but we get stories, we get articles and things, we go to conferences and we hear about these are things you shouldn't do. And probably one of the most common stories you and I hear all the time is, who's your beneficiary? We did a show a number of months ago on that topic itself. Who's your beneficiary? And people overlook the importance of beneficiary designation and getting that coordinated with your wishes. Story after story, the person who died and had their biggest asset was their investment or IRA account, and they had designated their first spouse as a beneficiary. And they had remarried since and had a new spouse with new kids, and that new spouse did not get that asset because beneficiary designation is a form of title. They even, when they got married the second time, they redid their will to make sure that their new spouse was included. But the biggest asset this gentleman owned when he died was his retirement account from his work. Millions of dollars went to his first spouse.
I bet she appreciated that.
She liked it, but the second spouse didn't. If it's possible to haunt a person for years after they die, that's going to be happening. I can tell you right now, that's going to be happening. Beneficiary designation is that important, yet it is so overlooked, and it's becoming very common to be able to do that, to designate a beneficiary on many of the type of assets that we own. Financial accounts now, many of them. Used to be that beneficiary designation was sort of reserved for a life insurance policy, but now you can do it on your retirement accounts, regardless of how they're invested. In fact, many investment accounts let you do a payable on death or a transfer on death. Banking accounts, CDs, money market accounts let you do a payable on death or transfer on death. Gary, that's a beneficiary designation, and that's going to dictate who gets that asset when we die, not our legal documents.
You're listening to Truth in Planning. I'm Gary Anderson, financial advisor, and I'm here with my co-host, Kevin Tharp, estate planning and elder law attorney. Kevin, that is an important thing, and a lot of times people don't understand just how strong a beneficiary designation is, how it does overpower everything else you wanted.
Absolutely.
And I think you've told me several times that it overrides a will. Sometimes people have a will, and that will is going to do nothing for them because they have beneficiary designations established with everything.
Gary, I was listening to a radio show not long ago, and the host and the advisor were talking about the topic of estate planning came up. And the person started talking about, yeah, that's real important to put it in writing and get a will. And it may only cost you a couple $100 to do it, but that's a real good investment to do it. And never talked about the importance of beneficiary designation. In fact, this person actually deals a lot with products, financial products, where you can designate a beneficiary. That is the most overlooked thing. That will trump your will every single time. So how do you get them coordinated? Well, first of all, you get them coordinated by not using a will as a part of your estate plan, but using a trust. Because see here, you cannot designate your will as a beneficiary on your retirement account or your life insurance policy. If you do that, what you're doing is making it your estate, and that's guaranteed that money's going to go through probate, and that's a huge mistake, especially with your tax qualified retirement account. You never want your estate to be a beneficiary. You never want your estate or not to name a beneficiary because it will go to your estate. So you need to either name a person or you can name a trust. Now, a lot of times people say, well, I got that covered. I got my spouse and I got my kids as my beneficiaries. Good. That's a good step. But here's even a better beneficiary designation. Make your trust the beneficiary. Why? Because if my wife is the beneficiary of my IRA, when I pass away, if she survives me but's incapacitated, then is that IRA money protected for her? No, because the IRA company is going to give her that money regardless of her condition. Same thing with my daughter. If I name my daughter as a beneficiary and she survives me but is in the middle of a divorce, and she has to be at least over 45 because she can't date until she turns 45.
We'll see.
So we'll see. We'll see if that works out. So she is in the middle of a divorce. Can her divorcing spouse get that IRA money that I leave her? And the answer to the question is yes, because I give it to her directly. In fact, the U.S. Supreme Court confirmed that in a case called Clark versus Ramamaker. Mother named her daughter as the beneficiary of her IRA, and when mother passed away, the daughter was in the middle of a divorce and bankruptcy, and between those two things, she lost every dime of a $350,000 IRA.
And that's a horror story.
It's a horror story, and that's a true story that went to the U.S. Supreme Court. Because beneficiary designation matters. That's why we recommend making a trust the beneficiary. It's not going to change the taxes on anything. IRAs are still taxable whether you get them directly or through a trust. So why make a trust the beneficiary? Asset protection for my beneficiaries.
One question, Kevin, and we've talked about this before. You've given people a good reason by the stories you're telling of why a trust is better than a will or any other type of estate planning. A trust is better, but I hear so often from people, well, I don't need a trust because I don't really have a whole lot. You've mentioned this before. I don't have much. I want to why do I want to do that? And one thing you've told me in the past, you can't put a beneficiary on your house and your property.
That's correct. And so a house is one of those things where you got to, is how it's titled right now. How is it owned right now? And since you can't put a beneficiary on your house, title your house in a trust, make your trust the beneficiary of your retirement account, your life insurance. Everything's in one place when you pass away. Everything is protected for your beneficiaries when you pass away, regardless of their condition. My trust takes into account if Missy survives me, but she's incapacitated. My trust takes into account if my daughter survives me, but she's in the middle of a divorce or bankruptcy. My trust takes that into account and protects them, and it avoids probate on top of it.
Kevin, I know some people would be interested in coming in to talk to you, and this is something that you, over the years, as we've done radio, you've gotten a lot of response, and people do come in. They want to be able to get things really more personal. They want to make sure that these things apply to them personally. They want information that applies to them specifically. So, Kevin, why don't you give them the information so they can come in and give you a conversation?
866-253-6994. If you can't remember the number, remember the name, KevinTharp.com.
And I think this is very important. Again, people should be able to have this conversation. Again, take the time. Make sure you do it. It's something that's very important. You're listening to Truth in Planning on News Talk AM 550 and FM 102.9 WDUN.